Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, our story follows Thomas DeSimone, the ambitious young man whose name became legend in New York's underworld. Known for his sharp instincts and relentless drive, DeSimone moved through the streets with quiet determination. To some, he was a loyal associate chasing respect. To others, a man whose temper and timing made him unforgettable in the world he chose. Before we begin, like this video, we're aiming for 100 likes in this video. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family. And share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. Your support motivates us to keep bringing you more powerful stories. Now, close your eyes and imagine the dim glow of a late-night diner, the hum of New York traffic outside, and the shadow of a man whose story lives on through whispers and memory. Settle in and let the story of Thomas DeSimone guide you into the night. He was born into a family already familiar with the shadows. Relatives had known the rackets, and the rhythm of envelopes, favors, and debts was not an exotic language in his childhood. By his teens, he was spending time near the corners where Lucchese family earners gathered, the sort of hangouts where a kid learned to keep his voice low and his eyes open. He was nothing like the character the world would later see in a film. The real Thomas stood well over 6 feet, lean and watchful, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who felt at home in back rooms. He liked sharp clothes, prized loyalty, and didn't mind being the one people called when something needed doing fast and without fuss. The pull toward JFK, still called Idlewild in the memories of older men, was irresistible. The airport meant movement. Trucks, crates, handlers, and cash. Crews skimmed off loads, greased insiders, and turned cargo into quick money in neighborhoods that lived off hijacked steaks, cigarettes, and designer clothes that had fallen off the back of a trailer. Thomas attached himself to the circle around James Burke, the fixer and planner who preferred patience over noise. Henry Hill, chatty and eager, drifted between errands, and the three formed a kind of engine for jobs that paid steady. Burke was the strategist, Hill the connector, DeSimone the muscle and the man with nerve. Thomas was still barely out of boyhood when he tasted a big score with Henry. In 1967, the pair pulled off what would later be famous, the Air France robbery, a simple plan built on an inside key and careful timing. They walked off with hundreds of thousands in cash from a cargo vault without firing a shot. That job didn't just enrich them, it cemented reputations. Thomas proved he could plan, wait, and move. No drama, no bravado, just execution. He liked that feeling, the speed and certainty of a clean job, and he grew more indispensable in Burke's crew. Hijackings became a way of life. They would learn a schedule, pick a spot, slide a truck off its route, unload into a warehouse or a quiet lot, pay the right people to look the other way, and break down the goods for resale. None of it needed force if the planning was sound and the drivers were scared enough. Thomas took pride in not wasting words. He wanted to be seen as reliable, the kind of associate who settled problems and delivered on promises. He also carried a reputation he cultivated. If a threat had to be real, he could make it real. That reputation kept doors open and mouths shut. Reputation, though, is a blade with two edges. Henry Hill would later tell law enforcement and writers that Thomas was quick to take offense and faster to escalate. In stories told under oath and to reporters, Hill said Thomas carried 2 pistols and an appetite for proving dominance. Those stories shaped what the public came to believe, but what matters most for the record is where accounts overlap, where dates and names match paperwork. Around 1970, several incidents would define him forever, and none of them could be shrugged off as just the life. One of those moments, widely repeated from Hill's later testimony, involved a young barback everyone called Spider. He ran drinks and cleaned up during card games, the kind of long nights that kept a crew together. The argument started low, then climbed. When it ended, Spider was dead, and Henry Hill would later say Thomas pulled the trigger. No charges were filed, no public case was made, but that story carried through time because people in that room kept telling it. It depicted Thomas as reckless and cold, and whether you accept every word or not, the impact on his circle was real. Men who laughed with him also learned to fear him. The most consequential act attributed to Thomas came that same year. A Gambino family member named William Billy Bats Bentvina had recently returned from prison. There was bad blood, the details of which have been argued ever since. What matters for history is what witnesses, informants, and investigators have consistently said. Bentvina was beaten in a bar linked to Burke's circle and later killed, and Thomas was central to it. In organized crime, that was a forbidden line. Bentvina was a made man, formally inducted in the Gambino family. Touching him without permission from top bosses invited retaliation beyond neighborhood quarrels. The killing set an alarm clock in another family, ticking down the days to an answer. That clock would matter more than any money Thomas ever took. Around this period, Hill also claimed Thomas killed a man named Ronald Foxy Girouth in Queens after a personal dispute. A case that deepened animosity with the Gambinos because Girouthi moved in their world. Public records on that homicide exist. Hill's account put Thomas at the center. Put together, those events painted a picture of a young enforcer who was useful to his own crew, yet dangerous to their long-term safety. Even allies who liked him couldn't ignore what those deaths would mean, in a city where lines between families were guarded with obsession. Yet, in day-to-day work, Thomas kept doing what he did best. He found truck drivers who would take a cut, airport workers who could pass along schedules, and fences who could move stolen shipments. He collected debts for bookmakers and loan sharks tied to Burke's operation, often in and around Robert's Lounge, a neighborhood bar that doubled as an unofficial office. He was married by then and had started a family. The life didn't slow for diapers and rent. It ran on schemes and payouts. Thomas wanted his own place inside the Lucchese orbit, not just as Burke's right hand, but as a man everyone had to greet first when they walked into a room. His temper, however, kept getting written into the margins of more incidents. Sometimes it earned him compliance. Sometimes it brought police attention or deepened feuds. On the legal front, he faced arrest typical for someone in that world: assault charges, theft-related busts, though nothing stuck long enough to derail him. Friends found him charming in quiet moments, a born storyteller, then caught themselves remembering the bodies that came up in whispers. That duality, easy laugh, sudden rage, made him compelling and frightening in the same breath. The airport rackets thrived as the 70s began. Every holiday meant more freight. Every strike meant more confusion to exploit. Thomas was there for shakedowns of cargo handlers, for sit-downs to divide slices of revenue, for smoothing out snags when a driver panicked or a detective got too close. He was also around for vicious lessons. If someone skimmed from a split or bragged outside the crew, they might vanish or be found in circumstances the papers called gangland style. Thomas's presence in those circles meant his name floated through investigations, even when files didn't have enough for indictments. The irony in all of this is that Thomas wanted what almost every ambitious associate wanted in that era: security through status. He was never formally a made man in the Lucchese family, despite his loyalty to Burke and the crew under Capo Palvario. He pressed to be recognized, according to those who later talked. He believed his work, his nerve, and his ties earned it. But that path ran through politics, and politics in that world also remembered every broken rule. Killing a made member in another family placed an invisible wall in front of him that no handshake in his own crew could remove. People who knew him say Thomas hated being underestimated. The later film that turned him into a short, quipping firecracker would have irritated him. The real man moved more like a basketball guard than a brawler, careful with his appearance, careful with his surroundings until a fuse blew. He liked to be early to a job, liked cars that ran clean, liked a table where he could see the door. Those habits kept him alive in rooms where yesterday's partner could be tomorrow's problem. They also show a young man who understood the stakes. He was not a cartoon. He was a functioning part of a machine that fed his neighborhood and fed on it. By the middle of the decade, Thomas had decades worth of experience compressed into a few brutal years. He had helped pull off legendary thefts, enforced debt collections, and, if you accept the testimony that shaped the public history, taken multiple lives that brought heat to his crew. He also watched as money erased problems for some and created new ones for others. Crimes around the two. Airport got bigger, bolder, and riskier. The teams needed to be tighter, and the payoffs fatter to justify the danger. Thomas stayed in the center of that swirl, confident he could outpace consequences he couldn't see. This is where memory and paperwork anchor together again. By reputation and by later accounts, Thomas was deeply embedded in the operations that led toward the Lufthansa heist, the mammoth theft that would headline 1978. He was the muscle side of planning meetings, the silent pressure behind obligations, the familiar face to truckers who had been paid to forget. Whether he physically walked into the cargo building on the night of the heist or handled other necessary work around it has been argued, but no history of that crime ignores his presence in Jimmy Burke's inner circle. Before that winter came, however, there were more debts to collect, more loads to move, and more tension with powerful men who had long memories. For now, the picture is this. A tall kid from Queens had become a feared and admired earner in a Lucchese crew built around airport thefts. He had tasted life-altering scores, carried out enforcement that carved his reputation, and committed acts some acknowledged in court testimony, some never proven in court, that set a trap he couldn't escape. He wanted elevation. He wanted recognition. Yet every day he woke up inside a timeline shaped by a single forbidden killing that guaranteed retaliation would someday arrive. The city kept moving, planes kept landing, and Thomas DeSimone hustled from one payday to the next, certain that he could keep his balance on a wire that was already fraying. He moved through those years like someone who knew the clock but believed it ticked for other people. Airport roads and side streets became his territory. He learned which guard changed shifts at what hour, which foreman had a side habit that made him vulnerable, which truckers would take a quiet envelope to forget a face. The bar where he and the rest gathered doubled as an office, court, and clubhouse. Everybody came through at some point. Bookies with ledgers, clerks with rumors, fencemen with car trunks that smelled like new leather and fresh tape. He kept his voice low, and his promises short. In that world, a name held weight when people paid attention without being told twice, and his name carried that kind of gravity. What he did day after day wasn't glamorous or cinematic. It was a system. The racket split into lanes. Cargo thefts, truck hijackings, gambling collections, shylocking, and smoothing out labor problems for a fee. He had a hand in each lane. Money flowed best around the airport, but it didn't stop there. Tobacco and liquor loads rolled over the bridges. Appliances and clothes took the expressway west. A lot of it ended up in basements and back rooms where it was broken down and sold piece by piece. Between those jobs, there were card games that never seemed to end, cash floating from one pocket to another, and the constant upkeep of relationships. He excelled at the face-to-face parts, quiet talks, firm reminders, the careful handling of someone who had started to panic. The stories that would later define him kept pace with that business. A fatal night involving a young barback known as Spider was whispered for years, then told openly by Henry Hill once he became a cooperating witness. The account put Thomas at the center of an argument that turned deadly. No charges ever stuck, no public case was built, but the tale affected how everyone viewed him. It marked him as someone who would escalate without hesitation. Another killing in Queens, of Ronald Foxy Giroth, also landed in his column according to Hill, and was reported in newspapers at the time. Giroth moved in circles close to the Gambino family. That act didn't just darken a reputation, it made enemies whose reach stretched citywide. The episode that mattered most in the long run involved William Billy Bats Bentvina, a formerly inducted member of the Gambinos. Accounts by Hill and others place Thomas as a lead figure in an assault that ended with Bentvina dead. That single choice crossed a boundary that street earners understood better than any written rule. Touching a made man without permission, guaranteed repercussions. Even people friendly to DeSimone recognized that line had consequences beyond his crew. From that point on, the air around him changed. Some associates stayed close because he delivered. Others stepped back, reading the risk. Still, the work didn't stop. Burke's crew had a rhythm that wasn't easily broken. At Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park, they held court. Problems came in, money went out, and information gathered in corners transformed into paydays a week or a month later. Thomas collected for bookmakers, made sure slot routes and card games remained undisturbed, and kept the airport pipeline humming. He was on hand for sit-downs to settle disputes over percentages. He dealt with drivers who decided to freelance. He helped set prices when a load needed to be moved fast before the wrong uniform started asking questions. He was trusted to be decisive, which meant he had latitude to fix things without calling upstairs. By the mid-1970s, local and federal pressure had grown. Investigators knew the airport had become a factory for theft and shakedowns. Raids hit stash houses, wiretaps clicked on phones, and a few lower-level participants flipped. RICO charges began appearing in indictments across the city. In response, the crews adapted. They became more careful with communications, relied on face-to-face talks, and kept sensitive details limited to a handful of people. Thomas fit that approach. He liked handling business in person. He saw the value in fewer words, fewer calls, and early starts. So he could be done by afternoon with nothing recorded except who had nodded yes. Meanwhile, gambling debts and side hustles connected the airport to midtown offices and Queens storefronts. A Lufthansa employee named Louis Werner, a compulsive bettor, racked up obligations he couldn't pay. A bookmaker named Marty Krugman pressed him. Pressure traveled through Henry Hill to Jimmy Burke. Werner knew things about a vault at the Lufthansa cargo building, specifically about cash that came in regularly from overseas. That stream of money, routinely stored before being transferred to banks, became the seed of one of the boldest thefts in American history. Planning for it didn't happen overnight. It was the product of a steady accumulation of insider tips, timing studies, and careful assignments. Though historians still debate the exact lineup of the crew that went into the building, there is broad agreement from investigators and later testimony that Thomas was part of the tight inner circle Burke relied on to make and enforce plans. His role in that period was clear: keep people aligned, apply pressure when needed, and ensure that anyone who had been promised a share stayed quiet and useful. He knew which drivers could be trusted to park a van where and when it was needed. He knew which watchman would look away if a familiar face told him, "We're good." He may not have been the architect, but he was one of the braces holding up the structure. Outside the heist planning, daily business continued. Hijackings brought in steady profits. Associates would meet a truck, steer it off course, and move its contents into a waiting warehouse, on a route nobody outside the crew used. Debtors who had borrowed at high interest, knew to pay on time or risk losing access to the forms of protection that kept their storefronts running. Thomas was often the person sent to make that point. He didn't need to shout. Showing up was usually enough. In an era when cops patrolled by routine and many neighborhoods protected their own, that kind of quiet pressure worked. There were also ongoing tensions with the Gambinos because of Giroth and Bentvina. Street politics required constant calibration. Burke and his mentor in the Lucchese family, Paul Vario, didn't want random collisions with another family's crew, especially one that dominated Ozone Park. At times, intermediaries tried to cool things. According to later accounts, there were attempts to smooth over specific flashpoints, to settle money issues, and to keep certain faces away from certain blocks. Some of that helped for a while, but relationships built on grudges don't heal easily, and people who lost friends didn't forget. When the Lufthansa plan finally ripened in late 1978, each person involved carried knowledge of only what he needed to know. Werner's role eventually drew law enforcement. Krugman disappeared soon after the job. Hill later maintained that Burke ordered that hit to keep the circle tight. In the years that followed, several men associated with either the lead-up or the aftermath of the heist were killed. Parnell Stacks Edwards, a musician who was supposed to get rid of a getaway van, was found dead not long after he failed to do his part. Some accounts credit Thomas as the one who handled that punishment. Other sources name a different shooter. The only confirmed truth is that Edwards was murdered, and the van mistake brought deadly consequences. The heist itself, on the 11th of December 1978, became immediate front-page news. Thieves took roughly $5 million in cash and close to $1 million in jewelry from the airline's vault, making it the largest cash robbery in the United States at the time. Although no court ever convicted Thomas for that crime, his proximity to the Joseph Burke crew, his role around the airport, and the way his name surfaces in witness statements place him in the story whether or not he was physically inside the building that night. He was part of the enforcement arm before and after, according to the most cited sources. He made sure promises were kept, or, when they weren't, that there were consequences. Law enforcement pressure after Lufthansa intensified. The FBI opened a task force. Agents surveilled Robert's lounge, followed cars to body shops and garages, and dug through union records. People in the orbit of the heist got arrested on unrelated charges. Some started talking to avoid long sentences. Henry Hill was one of those who would eventually cooperate. His later testimony gave the public a window into how the crew operated. From those accounts, Thomas appears as a constant presence, tall, self-assured, dangerous to cross, and trusted inside the Lucchese circle. While the public fixated on the heist, Thomas lived through winter like always, running collections, meeting Burke at the lounge, dropping in on earners who owed. He had married young and had children, and people who saw him away from work described a man who could be attentive and warm in short bursts before the street pulled him back. Those closest to him say he wanted recognition from the family he served. Being formally inducted would have given him status and protection. But the murder of a made man in another family hung over that ambition, like a locked door. Even if his own side wanted to raise him up, that offense was something the Gambinos wouldn't ignore. Rumors about his temper continued to travel. Some involved bar fights. Some involved money disputes. Others involved private matters that undermined his standing with higher-ups. Henry Hill would later allege that Paul Vario had personal reasons to dislike him that went beyond money and protocol. Those claims were never tested in court, but they carry through in multiple tellings. Whether or not Vario truly wanted him gone, word spread that Thomas's behavior, both the high-value work and the combustible incidents, had created too many risks. In a world obsessed with balance sheets, his contributions and his liabilities were being weighed. In the days immediately after the Lufthansa job, the crew became even more selective about who attended meetings, who held what cash, and who did follow-up tasks. A handful of figures in the outer circle who had expected big paydays were told to wait. Others demanded advances and were rebuffed. Tension rose. Burke's reputation for ruthlessness when silencing loose ends is well documented. Within weeks and months, several men connected to the operation or its planning were dead. The purge created fear but also rebalanced shares of the loot. It is against that backdrop that the final chapter of Thomas's life unfolded. Early in January 1979, he vanished. The date most often cited is January 14. People close to him believed he left for a meeting that he thought would change his life for the better. Later, Henry Hill told the FBI that Thomas believed he was going to be formally inducted into the Lucchese family. Hill said the ceremony was a setup, and that the Gambino family, furious over Benvina and Giroth, had arranged for his execution. Some versions name John Gotti's crew as responsible. Others point to different Gambino associates. No official case ever confirmed exactly who carried it out, where it happened, or where the body went. What is certain is that he never returned home and was never seen again. The disappearance shocked the tight circle at Robert's Lounge and did not surprise them at all, depending on whom you ask. On one hand, they had lost a reliable enforcer and earner who knew how their entire operation functioned. On the other, many had predicted a reckoning since the day Benvina died. Police reports, FBI files, and later books agree on the broad outline. A young man who had risen fast inside a powerful crew was erased in a countermove that fit the informal rules of that world. The lists of dead that piled up around Lufthansa were tragic enough, but his absence carried a special note because he had attracted both admiration and fear for so long. After he failed to come back, his wife and family made inquiries. There was no body, no crime scene, no public funeral. He became one more name on a list of presumed murders, with no recorded burial. Detectives filed missing person paperwork. With time, the case shifted into the category of unresolved Mafia disappearances that define New York's underworld history. Over the years, occasional claims surfaced, someone saying he was buried near a construction site. Someone else naming a rural property where a quiet grave could be found. But no credible recovery ever occurred. The mystery of his final moments remains a permanent part of his story. This is the harsh arc that emerges from the record. He started as a teenager, learning the world of hijacks and collections. He earned trust inside a Lucchese crew. He took part in high-profile thefts. He committed killings that drew the fury of another family. He played a role, direct or indirect, in the planning and enforcement around Lufthansa, and he disappeared before he turned 30. Nothing in those lines glamorizes what he did. They outline a short life spent in a system that rewards speed, nerve, and loyalty up until the ledger is reviewed and the liabilities outweigh the assets. The men around him kept moving, because that is what the life demands. But the hole he left influenced choices in that neighborhood for years. In telling this story, there are places where sources diverge. Hill's testimony is the backbone for many popular accounts, but he was one man talking under pressure with his own incentives. Still, his version overlaps with law enforcement intelligence and with newspaper reports from the era in enough places to form a stable core. Wherever the record is uncertain, that uncertainty is part of the truth. For the rest, the dates of robberies, the identities of the families, the public arrests, and the timeline of the Lufthansa heist are documented. Put together, They show how a single figure could rise inside a larger machine, and how decisions made in rooms with no recording devices could decide fates as definitively as any court. Before he vanished, he had shaped the street around him. Afterward, his absence shaped it even more. New faces took over collections, new handlers rebuilt airline schemes, and the old bar carried a different kind of quiet when someone mentioned his name. People who had gotten rich alongside him adjusted to life without him, sometimes pretending they hadn't seen him in a while, sometimes lowering their voices and changing the subject. Those who feared what might happen if he walked in stayed on guard out of habit, even though he was gone. In that sense, the last thing he took was the certainty that comes from expecting the usual guy to show up at the usual time. Morning broke over Rockaway Boulevard in a dull sheet of light, and he was already moving. He liked those early hours, when cargo crews swapped shifts and the roads felt half asleep. You could read a lot in those minutes. Which guard yawned and drifted? Which dispatcher kept a side account in his head? Which driver watched his mirrors too much? He logged those tells as if they were names in a ledger. He never wrote them down. He carried them, trusted them, and made a living on what they revealed. The airport was a heartbeat, and he knew when it skipped. He treated the logistics like a craft. Plates went on and off cars, without fanfare. Vans changed hands in alleys. Never in the same alley twice. Payphones mattered. A pocket full of dimes meant you could call someone who wasn't supposed to hear a phone ring at home. Meals were quick, always at places where the waitress already knew the order. If somebody didn't know the order, he didn't go back. He believed routine kept you safe, as long as you owned the routine, not the other way around. People around him noticed. They said he had the energy of a sprinter and the patience of a chess player until he didn't, and when that patience snapped, rooms emptied fast. He had started young, learning the rhythm of small scores before his 20s were done. What looked like chance was really a lattice of favors and timed steps. The old Air France job from 1967 kept coming up because it showed how he worked when everything clicked. An inside contact, a key, a walk-in, a walk-out, cash in a bag, no noise, not a shot fired, not a uniform awake enough to blink. He remembered that glow for a long time, not only because the money helped, but because it felt clean. You do the homework, you move with care, you go home richer and nobody gets hurt. He wanted the business to stay there, in that neat pocket. The street almost never let that happen. By the middle of the 1970 seconds, he had moved from apprentice to trusted operator. Jimmy Burke's circle depended on men who did not spook easy. Thomas fit that role. He was the problem solver who visited a driver who'd gone missing along with a pallet of cigarettes. He was the voice in a sit-down, pointing out that a certain warehouse had 2 cameras, not 1. He was the man you sent when a bookmaker's customer forgot what day it was. None of those tasks needed showy speeches. A knock, a nod, a brief sentence could reset a vendor's memory or pull a truck's route toward a different lot. He also leaned on old rules. You pay your end on time. You don't puff your chest at the wrong person. You never involve cops. If something goes wrong, you fix it fast and keep it small. Those rules kept money moving. They also gave him cover to carry out the rough parts of his job without apologizing for them. Everybody in that world had a job. Burke designed, Vario protected, Hill connected, and Thomas enforced. When he enjoyed the reputation that enforcement brought, it made business smoother in the moment. It also planted seeds he couldn't dig up later. Events that others later described in detail changed how people saw him forever. The death of the barback nicknamed Spider came up again and again after Henry Hill cooperated with law enforcement. Hill said Thomas fired the shots during a card game dispute. There was no public indictment, no trial, but the story stuck, and the men who repeated it did so with the quiet of people telling a memory they didn't shake. Another killing in Queens, Ronald Foxy Girouth, landed in newspapers and in Hill's later accounts. That act touched a different circle, one close to the Gambino family. You could feel the air cool after that. Lines had been brushed. Later, those lines were crossed. The beating and killing of William "Billy Bats" Bentvina became the boundary no one could ignore. Bentvina had status. He was a formally inducted member of the Gambinos. Touching him without permission wasn't a scuffle. It was a challenge to an entire power structure. Accounts agree that he was assaulted in a bar friendly to Burke's crew and later killed, and they put Thomas at the center of it. That act changed everything. Up to then, he had irritated some and frightened others, but he was still moving within the margins that crews bent for business. After that, he had a target on him that no amount of day-to-day earning could erase. Yet the street never pauses for reflection. Hijackings continued. Schedules had to be read. Drivers had to be courted. A load of designer clothes didn't know about inter-family politics. It just needed to be cut, sorted, and sold. He stayed busy. He worked out meetups with insiders, backed up friends when someone on a dock tried to freelance, and kept a steady hand on the pipeline from tarmac to trunk. The lounge in South Ozone Park remained the center. It ran like a small city hall. If you had a problem, you walked in and waited for a nod. If you had a tip, you leaned over a table and spoke low. He was in that room more days than he wasn't. Law enforcement pressure kept rising. The FBI and the Port Authority built lists of names. Detectives sat in cars across from the lounge and learned the cigarette habits of half the neighborhood. Wiretaps ticked on phones that were never supposed to mention work. Guys caught on small violations suddenly had long conversations with agents. In that climate, face-to-face business grew even more precious. Thomas liked that adjustment. He trusted his presence more than he trusted a phone. He favored early mornings, midday meets, and vanishing by evening. You could stay alive longer that way. You could also grow confident that your habits were smarter than the people watching you. A side stream of information turned into a river in 1978. A Lufthansa employee, drowning in gambling debt, knew the rhythms of a vault and confided in a gambler who owed a bookmaker who reported to Burke's Circle. That chain ran straight into rooms where Thomas was a regular. The plan that grew from it demanded patience. Who was on which shift? Which emergency doors actually opened? Which cameras were real? Which pallets moved on which days? Assignments were handed out. Tools were collected. Safe spots for vehicles were mapped. And as always, the number of people who knew full details stayed brutally small. The fewer who knew, the fewer who could talk later. When the robbery hit in December, it felt like weather. Money appeared as if it had poured from the sky. Newspapers screamed. Phones rang non-stop at federal offices. Burke kept his circle tight. Payouts were cautious. Some men expected envelopes and got told to wait. Others got told nothing at all. That delay would end lives. It would also feed the myth of the job for decades. People who had never been near a cargo building told stories about being there. The ones who actually mattered said less. And when they did speak, they trimmed the truth to what kept them breathing. One mistake put a crown on the tension. A musician named Parnell Stacks Edwards was supposed to get rid of a getaway van. He did not. The van was found, and it gave agents a map. They traced it to a chop shop, to associates, to a chain of faces that led straight back to the lounge. Within days, Edwards was dead. Hill later told investigators that Burke had sent Thomas to handle that punishment. Other names appear in different tellings. What nobody disputes is the outcome and the reason. A missed task at that level got answered fast. That kind of response kept others from fumbling. It also widened the circle of fear. As the winter dragged on, the rumors about Thomas thickened. Some thought he would be rewarded finally, given formal status, moved from earned respect to official rank. Others felt the opposite wind, that the killing of a made man had sealed his fate no matter how much work he did for his own side. In the bars and on the sidewalks, people kept their voices down when they said his name. He did his usual rounds, collections, check-ins, a drive past the airport at odd hours to read traffic, a stop at a diner where the coffee never got cold. He carried himself like someone who could steer clear of a trap because he had always found a way to slide past trouble. The day he left for what he thought would be a good thing, he carried no visible worry. According to Hill's later account, he believed he would be inducted. It was a mark he wanted, a seat closer to the flame. If those sources are right, that belief drew him out. He never came home. No body has ever been found. No crime scene ever confirmed. What came instead were whispers that the Gambino family had evened the ledger, that men aligned with a rising figure in that family had fulfilled a rule older than any face in Ozone Park. Thomas had crossed a forbidden line. The response arrived without public announcement, and with finality. His family waited and called. Friends made a few rounds to places where he might have cooled off if he'd wanted to be alone. Nothing. The lounge felt different that week. Chairs seemed farther apart. People cut short their visits. Burke, who did not often show nerves, wore a mask that was hard to read. Vario's camp kept quiet. On the street, some men said they saw it coming. Others looked stunned, because they had known him since he was a teenager, bouncing between corner stores and card games, and imagined he had another decade to run the table. Investigators logged a missing person case, and listened for any hint that would put them on dirt where shovels ought to go. None came. What followed was a strange kind of silence. The Lufthansa task force chased leads. The crew around the airport kept working in smaller steps. Dimmer light. More bodies appeared over the next year, some linked to the heist, some to old grudges, some to cuts that people decided were unfair. While that storm raged, Thomas remained a ghost. The men who had laughed with him learned new routines that did not include his shadow. A few took over his routes, his collections, his check-ins with airline handlers. No one used his name in the open. You didn't say the name of someone whose departure had likely been arranged by another family. You nodded if someone hinted, and you changed the subject. If you gather the pieces, his criminal record in the broad sense forms a clear picture. He hijacked trucks. He helped plan and execute cargo thefts, including the Air France job and the planning and enforcement around Lufthansa. He enforced debts for bookmakers and loan sharks working under Burke's umbrella. He maintained access to airport insiders, bought schedules, and moved stolen goods into Fence's hands. He intimidated, threatened, and, according to testimony that has shaped the public record, killed multiple people. The barback nicknamed Spider, Ronald Foxy, Giroth, and William Billy Bats Bentvina. He has also been tied by several accounts to the killing of Parnell Stax Edwards after the Lufthansa van mistake. He was arrested at times on assault or theft-related charges typical in that life, though those cases didn't end in long sentences. His name appears in FBI memos, in task force notes, and in pages of a book that made his crew famous for people who had never set foot in Queens. He did all of that before 30. He lived fast, not in the flashy movie sense, but in the practical one. Days jammed with risk, nights stuffed with conversations that could flip from jokes to threats in a heartbeat. He wanted upward mobility inside a structure that promised it only to those who broke fewer rules. He believed the money and loyalty he brought to his crew would outweigh the enemies he had made elsewhere. That calculation works until it doesn't. In his case, it didn't. And the moment the Blank Morris scale tipped, there was no way back to the room where plans got drawn and envelopes slid across tables. The legend that grew after his disappearance complicates the view. Movies reduced him, changed his size, turned his habits into punchlines and punch-ups. The real man carried a quieter menace and a sharper eye. He liked precision. He admired clean operations. He wanted to be seen as dependable first, dangerous second. He was sometimes both. The airport rackets rewarded that blend more than anything else. Theft dressed as logistics. Enforcement dressed as a handshake. He wore both well enough to climb high and fast. He also wore them loudly enough to be seen by rivals who counted insults the way accountants count pennies. Years later, when Henry Hill sat with agents and with a writer, he gave a version of Thomas that stuck in the public mind. That version is the spine of much of what we think we know. The jokes at a bar that soured into a killing. The sudden violence. The two pistols. The swagger. The temper. The lethal stubbornness. It is useful, and it overlaps with evidence and with other witnesses in key places. It is also one man's view, shaped by deals he made to preserve himself. Even allowing for that, the visible record supports the outline. A tall kid from Queens, fierce and capable, who became a central figure in a crew that lived off an airport and who disappeared when the world beyond his crew answered for one particular act. Think about what that says about the life he chose. It offers money that seems easy until it isn't. It offers friendships that feel like family until they are weighed against debts and politics. It offers status that can be revoked without ceremony. He embraced all of that with his eyes open. He liked the control it gave him day to day. He liked the feeling of directing a truck off a schedule without anyone noticing until it was too late. He liked walking into a room and having the room lean his way. That traction kept him moving. It also made enemies ring bells above doors he never expected to enter. He was not a myth inside his neighborhood. He was a man people recognized on sight. He bought sandwiches. He joked with doormen. He paid a mechanic on time. He handled errands for older relatives. He did the human things in between the criminal work, which only sharpened the shock when he failed to show up. The quiet truth after that is how quickly the city moved on. New money arrived at the lounge. New drivers learned new routes. New inside men offered keys to new doors. The airport hummed. The business adapted. Only at odd times outside a bar late at night, or on a side street near the cargo buildings at dawn, did someone look around and remember how tall he was, how sure of himself, and how quickly he seemed to own those streets until they owned him. In the end, his story sits at the crossroad of three forces: ambition, discipline, and fury. Ambition pushed him from errand boy to indispensable man. Discipline made him a planner and kept him from foolish mistakes most days. Fury crashed through both when insults felt too sharp or delays too long. That mix defines him more honestly than any one scene anyone tells. It explains the money that came his way, the fear he created, the admiration he earned among his own, and the reasons other men made a plan that included him not coming home. It is a short life with a long echo, documented in police files, court transcripts, books, and the memories of people who still measure certain streets by how they felt when he walked them. Snow fell in thin lines along Cross Bay Boulevard the week after he disappeared, and people kept showing up at the same doors, more out of habit than hope. A bartender wiped the same spot on the counter and listened to a radio news update about the airport heist like it was weather. Nobody said his name too loud. They didn't need to. He had been a presence for so long that silence did the talking. The lull pushed memories forward, and those memories showed a path that started way before the Lufthansa headlines, back when he was just a tall kid, drifting from errand to errand for men who already lived inside the margins of the law. He grew up seeing the codes long before he could quote them. Cash moved in envelopes at holiday dinners. Favors got traded without receipts. An uncle knew a guy at a loading dock. A cousin had a line on a warehouse job. The message was steady. Security came from people, not paperwork. In Queens, that translated into a kind of map in his head: who owed, who could be trusted, who deserved distance. He wasn't born into rank, but he understood that the street had its own classrooms. He learned to keep notes in his memory, not on paper, and to act like he had been there before, even when he hadn't. The gateway that mattered sat on the edge of the borough, a small city wrapped in runways and fences. The airport drew every type: handlers who lifted heavy boxes for light pay, supervisors who could be tempted, truckers who kept late hours and made rent one delivery at a time. It was a marketplace of information as much as goods. He slipped into that flow through the men he admired and feared, especially the seasoned hand who ran big plays without raising his voice. Working under that umbrella meant doing a little of everything: scouting, smoothing, nudging, collecting. It was less about force and more about control, knowing when to be present and when to be invisible. He never pretended to be something he wasn't. He knew he wasn't eligible for formal induction the way some around him were, and he accepted that while aiming for a different kind of standing, the sort that made people adjust their plans when he walked in. He wanted to be indispensable. That wish drove him out of bed before dawn and into cars that smelled like oil and leather, across side streets where men lit cigarettes in their palms to hide the glow, through diners where a waitress could recite his order without seeing him. He kept lists in his head: names of drivers, habits of guards, quirks of dispatchers. He updated that list daily, like a coach rewriting a playbook after every game. The magic of the early scores lived in their simplicity. The Air France theft showed that most power in that world flowed through access, not force. An insider, a key, patience, and timing. That was the formula. No bravado, no chaos. Just a quiet walk into a space where money was kept, and a quiet walk out with bags that changed the next year of everyone's life. He liked that feeling because it matched how he saw himself. Careful, alert, efficient. The world around him, though, didn't stay in that clean lane, and neither did he. Pressure, pride, and the need to project strength warped decisions. And those decisions put him on a different path. People who were there later told investigators about nights that ended in tragedy. A young barback nicknamed Spider, allowed back and forth at a card table, a fatal turn. Another man in Queens linked to the Gambino circle, Ronald Foxy Giroth, lost his life after a personal feud that became a matter of street politics. Then came the beating and killing of William Billy Bats Bentvena, a formerly inducted member of the Gambinos. That act mattered more than any stack of cash. Inside that world, it violated a boundary that everybody knew. It didn't matter if you were a valuable earner in your own crew. Hurting a made man in another family set off a chain that led to only one kind of ending. He kept moving anyway, leaning on the belief that money and utility could shield him from the storm he had called in. If you walked into Robert's lounge on any given afternoon in those years, you could see how his presence worked. A nod sent someone to the payphone. A raised eyebrow pushed a driver to admit what he had taken off the top. A glance at a ledger corrected a percentage in a way that made the other man swallow and agree. He collected for bookmakers and loan sharks, watched over card games, and kept an eye on docks where expensive boxes slid from forklifts into vans that didn't belong to the airline. He rarely needed to raise his voice. Being in the room was usually enough. That's how reputations pay dividends. Less friction, more result. Meanwhile, the city's other underworld pillars watched. The Gambinos controlled many slices of Ozone Park and Howard Beach. They saw who moved where, who ate whose lunch. After Giroth and Bentvena, the temperature around him dropped. There were attempts to smooth things, a handshake here, a promise there, but those attempts were like thin blankets in a blizzard. Past a point, even old friendships couldn't buffer the calculus. On paper, his own side valued his output. On the street, another side kept a ledger marked with names, and his was written in thick ink. Law enforcement didn't stand still. Port Authority police, city detectives, and the FBI had their own maps. They logged cars, faces, drop-off points, and rhythms of life at the airport. They knew the lounge and the diners and the garages. They clipped photographs and stapled them to memos. As RICO statutes gained traction, they built cases from patterns rather than single events. He adjusted by stripping his life down. Shorter calls, more meetings in person, tighter circles of trust. He preferred it that way, and for a while it gave him room to keep working. But tight circles also breed resentments, and in the late 1970 seconds, there was a lot of money at stake. The Lufthansa plan grew out of a gambler's panic. A worker in debt talked to a bookmaker, pressure moved up the chain, and soon the biggest prize in the cargo world sat on a chalkboard in a back room. The job demanded patience and secrecy. Only a few people knew enough to make it work, and they treated knowledge like contraband. He was near the center of those talks, not the brain, but the steady hand that pushed tasks along and kept shaky men from spoiling months of careful preparation. After the job hit and cash flooded the city, the very secrecy that made it a success turned deadly. Shares were delayed. Promises were reconsidered. Fear of witnesses grew. Within weeks, bodies began to drop. A musician asked to dispose of a van failed to do it and was killed. The cleanup was as relentless as the planning had been. All of that churn set the stage for the quiet end. In January 1979, he walked toward a meeting he believed would lift him into the rank he had always wanted. That's what one of his closest associates later told the FBI. Others say he was summoned to settle a grievance he couldn't ignore. However it was described to him, he went. He did not return. No scene, no official confirmation, just an absence that hardened into fact. People in the neighborhood said it was the Gambinos, furious at the breaking of a rule that wasn't supposed to bend. Some named famous figures. Some whispered about a house, a basement, a place near the water, or a dump where unwanted things vanish for good. None of those stories ever produced remains. What came after his disappearance helps explain the scale of what he had been part of. Henry Hill made a deal with federal agents in 1980 and began talking. Those interviews turned into cases, convictions, and, eventually, a book that pulled back the curtain on life around the airport. The strategist he had worked under went down on other charges, including a college basketball scheme and robberies unrelated to Lufthansa. He died in custody many years later. The capo whose crew had provided cover went to prison on racketeering counts and died after release. None of those convictions included a solved case for his disappearance. On paper, he remained a missing person. In reality, Everyone close to the life understood what had happened. His wife and children lived with not knowing. That uncertainty is its own sentence. There is no headstone, no exact date, no address to visit. Only a calendar and a gap. Friends learned to speak about him in past tense, while watching for any official word that never arrived. Detectives kept a file with a tag that said missing, and every so often a tip would push someone to check a patch of ground that hid nothing but roots and trash. Reporters called, then stopped. The neighborhood adjusted because neighborhoods always do. The airport got new fences and better cameras. The math changed, and so did the faces at the lounge. What makes his story persist is not only the crimes, but the way his life shows the logic of that world. Loyalty mattered until it collided with larger loyalties. Money covered a lot of problems until it didn't. Status was a promise that could evaporate. He chased legitimacy inside a structure that reserved it for a few and demanded discipline he didn't always show. When he enforced debts, people paid because they believed he would back up his words. When he crossed lines, people believed that would be answered too. Both beliefs were correct, and that's the thread that runs through every account, from agents' reports to neighbors' memories. If you pull back and look at the airport ecosystem he helped build, you see why he was valuable. Cargo moved in patterns. A wholesaler expected a shipment of watches. A boutique waited on designer coats. A grocer counted cases of imported liquor. A broker looked for a box with diamonds. Most of those items touched hands before they reached their listed destinations. He was one of the men who redirected those hands. He did favors, collected markers, and kept the line between intimidation and persuasion blurry. When the stakes demanded it, he used the darker tools available to him, tools that turned grudges into funerals and rumors into silence. The acts attributed to him by witnesses and investigators draw the outline of his record. He took part in airport thefts and hijackings that made serious money. He enforced for bookmakers and loan sharks tied to his crew. He handled disputes in card rooms and on sidewalks. He played a role in the planning or aftermath of major scores, including the 1,967 Air France job and the 1,978 Lufthansa heist. He was named by a central witness as the man behind multiple killings that shaped his fate. The barback known as Spider, Ronald Foxy, Giroth, and William Billy Bats Bentvina. He was also linked in some accounts to the retaliation that followed the van mishandling after Lufthansa. Some arrests came and went with light results, typical of that era's cat and mouse. But the larger file with his name on it was always heavier than any single case. Years later, a film turned him into a character with a different body and a distilled personality. Audiences remember the volatility. People who knew him remember the calculation between those bursts. They remember a man who treated logistics like a craft, who liked clean lines and a plan, who tried to control outcomes in a world that punishes the illusion of control. The difference between the man and the character matters for the history, because it reminds us that he wasn't a cartoon. He was a person who made choices inside a complex social structure, choices that paid for meals and cars and rent, and choices that made enemies who never stopped counting. There were claims later that personal slights added fuel to the fire that consumed him. One account said a senior figure on his own side had reasons to resent him that weren't strictly business, and that those reasons blended with inter-family politics when the decision about his fate was made. Those claims were never aired in a courtroom, but they appear in multiple tellings by people who were there. Whether or not those details are fully accurate, the outcome would likely have been the same. The murder of a made man was the kind of act that didn't require extra reasons to elicit a response. It had its own gravity. You can walk past the airport today and still see the traces of what he helped shape. Improved security grew out of theft patterns he exploited. The way airlines locked down cash and high-value items was hardened by losses recorded in the years he was active. Investigative models that focused on networks rather than one-off crimes took root because of crews like his. His name appears in training slides for agents who weren't born when he vanished, not because he was the biggest figure of that time, but because his story ties together the elements that produced the era's biggest cases: access, organization, audacity, and the hard ceiling that violence imposes. For the people who lived around him, his legacy is more intimate. A mechanic remembers a tip that came on time. A clerk remembers a warning delivered without theatrics that nevertheless changed how he counted money. A neighbor remembers a winter coat offered at a price that made no sense. A relative remembers a holiday dinner with a chair that stayed empty for reasons no one explained. Those small memories outlast headlines. They make the past a little heavier and the present a little sharper, because they show how men like him wove themselves into a neighborhood until the day they were ripped out of it. Set down plainly, his path is clear. He started young, in a world that rewarded nerve. He learned from men who preferred precision. He earned money from trucks, cargo, cards, and collections. He developed a reputation that delivered cooperation and fear in equal measure. He crossed lines that guaranteed payback. He stood near one of the largest cash robberies in U.S. history, then vanished weeks later under circumstances that matched the unwritten rules of his world. No grave, no official ending, only a set of facts anchored by consistent testimony, case files, and the stark logic of how things get settled when rules are enforced without courts. The city absorbed him, and then erased him, as it does. Planes keep landing, bars keep closing at 2. Men with new names sit where he once sat, learning the same lessons and convincing themselves the clock ticks for someone else. His story is a marker, a way to understand how quickly a person can rise on skill and nerve and how swiftly an unwanted debt can come due. However you feel about the choices he made, the record shows a life lived at high speed and narrow lanes, and an end that arrived the way a lot of ends arrived in that time and place. Without a headline that says it plainly, without a courtroom, without a goodbye. The city didn't stop for mysteries. Planes still banked over the Belt Parkway, cabs still lined up outside terminals, and the hum of cargo bays kept its tempo. In that steady noise, his name turned into a pause people left hanging in a sentence. He had been visible for years. Tall frame, sharp clothes, quick eyes, and then he was air. That absence pulled attention back through the years, to the places where he first learned how to turn traffic and routine into profit without drawing a crowd. Those early lessons explained everything that followed, including why people expected him to keep slipping past consequences until the day he didn't. He came from rooms where nobody raised their voice if they could avoid it. Older men kept counsel in corners, explained that information beat force, and reminded younger faces that favors outlived money. A teenager soaking up that outlook picked up small errands at first, then smarter ones, arranging a meeting, delivering a message, watching a warehouse door, and noting who carried clipboards and who carried keys. He wasn't born into a title. He earned proximity. The men he wanted to impress measured worth in reliability, not boasts. Show up, keep quiet, do the job. Remember what matters. He carried that ethos into every hallway near the airport. The airport in those days was a marketplace wrapped in a fence. 1,000 tiny interactions under fluorescent lights decided where money would land. He learned the choreography and treated it like a craft. Which utility door squeaked? Which supervisor showed up early on Fridays? Which driver clocked in but took an extra lap before rolling toward the gate? He built a mental map of habits, and habit is what people fall back on when they think they're not being seen. That was his advantage. He saw patterns and inserted himself where they would pay him back without sparking headlines. Before he had a reputation, he had a blueprint he borrowed from older hands who never rushed. The famous Air France grab, in 1967, captured the tone of those years. An inside contact. A key. Timing that let 2 men enter a room, collect cash, and leave as if they had always belonged there. No shouting, no alarms, just a clean execution and a quiet split afterward. It stood as a model for the life he wanted. Focused, profitable, almost invisible. He enjoyed the neatness of it because it matched how he preferred to move. But the street won't let neatness last. As the 70s unfolded, small sparks became open fires, and his name got attached to several that could not be ignored. Colleagues who later sat in interview rooms described incidents that turned into defining markers. The death of the young runner they called Spider is one of those. Henry Hill, speaking to agents and later to a reporter, said an argument in a card game ended with Thomas firing the fatal shots. No case was brought in court tied to that claim, no body of evidence tested by a jury. Yet the story stayed because it matched how men in that room remembered the energy of those nights. Tense, prideful, one insult away from permanent injury. Another name appears in testimony in newspapers from the time. Ronald Foxy Giroth, a Queens figure close to Gambino circles, killed after a personal feud spilled into a wider dispute. That death added more than a line to a file. It hardened attitudes in a neighborhood where territory and status overlapped. The most consequential step was the attack and killing of William "Billy Bats" Benvina, an inducted Gambino member. Here, multiple accounts align on the essential outline. Benvina was assaulted at a bar favored by Burke's Circle and died soon after. Hill and others placed Thomas at the center. In that world, this wasn't simply violence, it was a rule violation of the highest order. The consequences did not need to be written down. They were part of the air veteran earners breathed. He kept working, kept earning, kept showing up, convinced that value to his own crew would buffer the blow. The math that would later be applied to him started that night. Daily work ran alongside those grudges. Robert's Lounge functioned as a switchboard for money and messages. Bookmakers settled tabs, truckers waited for nods, airport handlers whispered schedules. He collected debts, guarded the quiet around backroom games, and made sure trucks shaded into side streets when schedules demanded. He liked the days when competence solved problems. He preferred to apply pressure with presence, not volume. That kind of calm authority made men of all ages change their plans with minimal drama. It also created a layer of fear that kept things orderly in the short term and added to his risk in the long term. Across town, law enforcement built its own rhythm. The Port Authority tracked thefts, the NYPD logged hijackings, and the FBI started to think in networks rather than isolated incidents. RICO gave prosecutors a new frame: patterns over time, enterprises rather than one bad day. Surveillance vans idled near the lounge. Cameras clicked as men stepped out of diners. Phones went live with wires. Each move tightened the corridor. Crew members adapted by speaking less on the phone, meeting in person, and treating information like cash. He thrived under those conditions because he had always preferred eye contact and short sentences. The more the outside world listened, the less there was to hear. Pressure brought opportunity with the Lufthansa lead. A Lufthansa worker, swamped by gambling debt, leaned on a bookmaker for mercy. That bookmaker answered to Burke's Circle. Those lines converged in rooms where the air felt still, and plans took shape one detail at a time. Who would be on duty? Which door might be susceptible? Where vehicles could stage without drawing attention. Assignments were modular. Most men knew only their own role, and that compartmentalization kept the plan stable. He sat in that inner coil, not the architect but a critical support, the one who made sure no soft link broke as the date approached. The money that exploded out of that vault in December 1978 changed lives and ruined them. It was the largest cash haul the country had seen. The success magnified risk. Payouts were delayed, or reduced, or denied. Anxiety ate at men who had expected envelopes. Loyalty got tested in whispers, and ended in silence for some. One task after the robbery stands out, because of how public its failure became. A musician named Parnell Stacks Edwards was supposed to dispose of a getaway van. Agents found it, intact, and turned it into a breadcrumb trail. Edwards was murdered soon after. Sources put Thomas on the team that carried out that punishment. Other accounts point to different shooters. The fact that matters is the outcome and its message. Mistakes that big did not linger. January arrived with cold and unsent letters. He vanished in the middle of that winter. The most consistent account, offered by Hill after he chose to cooperate, says Thomas believed he was heading to be formally inducted into the Lucchese family. That belief would have made sense from inside his own ambition. Another version says he was summoned to answer for older business. Either way, he went to meet people he expected to see and did not come back. Law enforcement never found remains. Over the years, rumors pointed to a basement, a construction site, a lot near an old house, or land outside the city. None yielded proof. In the following months, the Lufthansa investigation accelerated. The insider at the airline, the bookmaker who had squeezed him, and several men on the periphery faced charges. Some disappeared. Some were convicted on different counts. The strategist at the core of Thomas's world went down later on state and federal cases that included point shaving in college basketball and other rackets. He never faced a Lufthansa conviction, but died in custody long after. The capo who protected the crew spent years in prison for racketeering. Those outcomes sketched the collapse of the ecosystem Thomas had helped maintain, yet his disappearance remained a separate, shadowed chapter, understood but unresolved. His family lived in a limbo that hits differently than grief. No funeral to mark an end. No official cause of death. Just a frozen date on a calendar and a slow reshaping of daily routines where his return had once been assumed. For them, the true cost of a life spent in clandestine work was the way it could be erased without a form to sign. Friends, even those who had worked closest to him, adapted with the speed that life in that world demands. People took over his routes. Someone else stood at the lounge's back table. The airport moved, as it always had. The public learned his name in stages. First as a rumor in articles about hijackings and airport thefts. Then as a sharper silhouette in Henry Hill's testimony and the book that came from it. That book turned into a film that shaped the country's image of him more than any stack of court documents ever would. The movie condensed, exaggerated, and in places swapped truth for story. It made him shorter, louder, more brazen minute by minute. People who had known the real man recognized pieces the temper, the sudden pivots, but said the understatement was missing. The real Thomas did not live life at a constant shout. He moved with purpose, then flared, then went quiet again. For the record, what matters is that the key events, hijackings, enforcement, the Air France theft, the Bentvina killing, the Lufthansa planning and aftermath, the disappearance have anchors and sources beyond a screenplay. Historians and reporters still debate details. Was he at the Lufthansa building that night, or in a support role outside? Who exactly issued the final order that removed him? Did personal slights inside his own crew make it easier for rival hands to reach him? Some say a senior figure disliked him for reasons that mixed business with private anger, and that this shaped how protection around him ebbed. Those claims rely on memories and motives that were never tested under cross-examination. So they sit in the credible but unconfirmed pile. The simpler truth, supported by the logic of that world, is that the killing of a made man in another family required a response. It would have landed on anyone, no matter how well they earned. The full range of crimes tied to his name is clear enough to list without embellishment. He took part in coordinated cargo thefts at the airport and in truck hijackings on city routes. He operated as an enforcer for bookmakers and loan sharks under the umbrella of a Lucchese crew. He was linked by a primary witness and multiple secondary accounts to killings that reshaped his fate. The cardroom runner, known as Spider, Ronald Foxy Giroth in Queens, and William Billy Bats Bentvina of the Gambinos. He was associated, in some tellings, with the murder of Parnell Stax Edwards after the van misstep that hurt the Lufthansa crew. He had arrests sprinkled through those years on charges like assault and theft, the kind of rap sheet common to men in his slot, but no long prison sentence carved out a pause in his trajectory. That uninterrupted run ended not in court but in a void. If you stand at the edge of the old cargo zone and look across the runways, you can still trace the legacy of those days. Security changed because men like him found gaps. Cash no longer sat as casually as it once did. High-value shipments moved with more layers around them. Investigators sharpened their sense for how networks operate, learning to read social ties as carefully as they read ledgers. His name threads through those lessons in brief, mentions a report here, an affidavit there, an aside in a training slide for a young agent who knows the story mostly through a film and a handful of dates. In neighborhoods where crews once drank espresso on stoops and watched kids pedal by, his absence settled into the background hum. A mechanic remembered that he tipped well and wanted work finished before noon. A retired dispatcher remembered a man who knew his schedule too well and used that knowledge to negotiate in a way that felt both friendly and ironclad. An old friend remembered summer nights heavy with the smell of gasoline and grilled sausage, when a tall young man laughed easily and somehow made everyone else check their posture. Those moments round him out in a way the headlines can't. They make him a human figure inside a harsh system rather than only a list of acts. What makes his story difficult to forget is the way discipline and volatility held equal sway in him. He could be meticulous for weeks, scouting, smoothing, keeping risks low, then swing hard at a perceived slight and force everyone around him to absorb the consequences. That duality made him an asset to his crew until the liabilities caught up. It made him magnetic in rooms where everyone measured strength in quiet ways. It also placed him on a path where the strongest person in one circle remains exposed to the decisions of people above and beyond it. The The conclusion drawn by those who lived it feels both precise and inevitable. He rose because he read people and places well, because he showed up when others hesitated, because he carried himself with the confidence that makes money move toward you. He fell because the code he accepted from the start doesn't bend on certain points, and because his temperament drew him past a line that code protects. The airport kept its schedule the next day, and the bar opened as usual. That is how these stories end in the city. A sudden gap, a few nights of whispers, then the same chairs occupied by other men who think they can handle the rules better. Time has not changed the contours. His file remains unsolved in the formal sense, and complete in the practical one. He is recorded as missing and remembered as gone. His life reconstructed through testimony, case notes, and the day-to-day recollections of people who ran the same streets. In that reconstruction, you see the full picture. The logistics pro who could move a truck off route without drama, the enforcer who didn't need to shout, the ambitious associate who wanted a ceremony that never came, the man whose choices made rivals take a decision into their own hands. It is a true account, shaped by overlapping sources, told without glamour, and grounded where the record is solid. The rest is silence, the kind that settles over a runway at 3 a.m, when you can hear your own breath and the distant hiss of tires on wet pavement. Winter loosened its grip, but the rumor never thawed. In the months after he vanished, people switched from asking where he'd gone to saying nothing at all. The lounge normalized itself by habit. A new kid broke down cartons. An old-timer ran the book. A driver who used to wait for his nod learned to take orders from somebody else. Yet his absence sat in those rooms like an extra chair. He had been part of the rhythm for so long that even the sound of an ashtray sliding across wood reminded people of how quiet he could make a space feel just by walking in. What he built before that winter didn't rely on noise. He specialized in leverage disguised as courtesy. If a shopkeeper fell behind, he appeared with a calm tone and a plan that got the debt back on track. If a driver got brave and freelanced, he offered a shortcut back to safety that came with a cost. His strength came from understanding where people already wanted to go and nudging them there with a reminder about who kept their lives smooth. That efficiency made him valuable in a business where too much drama drew attention and attention brought squads with notebooks. He found satisfaction in logistics that most people ignored. He knew when a forklift jammed a loading bay for 10 minutes every night because a pallet never matched its manifest. He knew which security guard had a bad knee and took a different staircase to avoid discomfort. He tracked which dispatcher let vehicles linger in buffer lot B because he liked to chat with a particular coworker in the late afternoon. These weren't spy tricks. They were patience and observation. When you combine those with the ability to make people comply, you get a map of a place that lets you move money without setting off alarms. Even with that craft, choices he made documented in later testimony and echoed in law enforcement files reshaped the path beneath him. A card game dispute that ended in a young runner's death lingers in the accounts of those nights. A feud with a Queen's figure close to Gambino circles ended similarly. Those moments altered his reputation from reliable presence to man you don't cross. The attack on William Billy Bats Bentvina, an inducted Gambino, crossed into a different category altogether. You didn't need a law book to understand the line that action violated. Men around him knew the rule and knew the likely penalty. He stayed the course anyway, convinced that earning for his own side would protect him. His belief held until it did not. Law enforcement saw his world from a distance at first, then close enough to memorize the coffee orders at the lounge. The Port Authority logged every theft that smelled like an inside job. Detectives watched drivers who happened to meet cousins 3 times a week in the same parking lot at odd hours. The FBI started mapping relationships with the care a surveyor uses on a property line. They learned that you couldn't catch the airport theft racket one truck at a time. You had to understand who sat where in the unofficial hierarchy, who granted permission, who answered emergencies, who collected the last dollar. His name appeared in those diagrams, not always with charges attached, but often as a key connector. He avoided long bids, not because he beat airtight cases in court, but because most cases never got airtight. Witnesses stayed silent. Paper trails were thin. Many arrests ended in dismissals or minor penalties. That pattern gave him confidence that planning and discretion would always keep him a step ahead. Attorneys understood this life's rhythm. Make the calendar your friend. Challenge paperwork. Undermine chain of custody. Remind jurors that no one on the stand had been in the room. For years, That strategy kept him moving across the same streets in the same cars, with agents trailing a step behind, and then peeling off when overtime ran out. As the airport rackets matured, money moved not only through vans and warehouses but through a web of fences and brokers spread across the city. Jewelry went to buyers who asked for 3 stones and took 5. Coats and suits flowed to garment district rooms where labels were swapped. Liquor appeared at neighborhood bars with prices too good to be legitimate but too consistent to be random. He knew the value of keeping that network polite. He insisted on timely payments, not temper tantrums. A calm visit from him kept the line between cooperation and fear blurry, and blurry lines make more money than clear ultimatums right up until someone decides to test the boundary. His ambition inside the Lucchese orbit centered on respect. He wanted the phone to stop ringing when he walked in. He wanted a seat that belonged to him no matter who else sat at the table. Formality tempted him because he understood the insulation that came with it. According to the most cited witness who later cooperated, he believed that insulation was finally coming. That belief, plausible from his angle, carried him out a door in January and into a void that has never been filled with official facts. The people who might have welcomed him at that meeting were the same people who understood that older debts demanded payment. Accounts attribute the decision to men in Gambino circles who followed their own code with quiet certainty. No agency ever closed that loop on paper, but the logic holds. Henry Hill's choice to cooperate in 1980 changed what the public could see. His interviews provided structure to the jumble of rumors that had defined the airport crews in newspapers. He outlined who planned, who enforced, who linked the parts. He described Thomas not as a cartoon, but as a man whose volatility could interrupt weeks of careful work. A man who carried 2 pistols and liked to project calm until boredom or insult switched a light inside him. Hill's credibility was tested in courts, and by time, he faced his own motives and deals. Yet his accounts aligned with surveillance notes, with older police reports, and with the rhythm investigators had already mapped. That overlap is why his version still anchors the story. Books and movies followed. They turned the crew's routines into scenes people could recite. The film that made the story mainstream shifted details, height, cadence, expressions, and compressed personalities. The character inspired by Thomas became a spark-plug version of the real figure, boiling over every few minutes. Those who had known him pointed out the differences. The real man was quieter, more meticulous, more likely to study a situation for hours and give up on speaking altogether if he thought quiet would do more. Both versions shared the fuse, though, and the fuse explains the axe that ended his run. That's the hardest part to square with the way the movies hum. The truth is often calmer, and in the end, colder. Back at the airport, the ripple effect of his years at work lingered in the policies that changed. Cash no longer walked through cargo rooms with the same casual custody. High-value shipments acquired layers that discouraged quick inside jobs. The Port Authority and the airlines, burned by thefts that looked like timing more than force, rebuilt schedules and tightened oversight. Some of that effort succeeded. Some moved thefts to different lanes. The idea that you could skim a little from everything faded as systems learned to track small losses with the same focus once reserved for spectacular ones. His era taught institutions to be suspicious of routine, because routine is where men like him did their best work. Inside the neighborhood, the losses shook out in human terms. A few men who had depended on his presence struggled to collect what they were owed because the person who gave their threats credibility was gone. Others found it easier to breathe because the man who made them feel small no matter how long they had known him had vanished. A handful felt both. Even the people who disliked him often respected what he could get done when most would have stalled. That mix explains why some predicted his end years earlier and still felt stunned when it arrived. The questions that remain have attracted theories that never stood under legal light. Some say personal slights within his own circle made it easier for rivals to reach him. That a senior figure on his side had reasons beyond money to step back and let gravity do its work. Those claims rest on one cooperating witness, a few other voices, and the way resentments behave in small worlds. Whether or not any private grudge contributed, the core cause doesn't change. In that system, a killing like Bent Venus pulls a lever bigger than personal friendship. That lever moves machinery that outmuscles any single protector. His criminal record in the broad sense remains what overlapping sources show. He learned the airport racket young, took part in hijackings and coordinated cargo thefts, and enforced collections for bookmakers and loan sharks tied to his crew. He was central within the circle around the strategist who ran operations near the airport. He had a role in the 1967 Air France theft that proved how much access matters. He moved through planning and enforcement around the 1,978 Lufthansa job that rewrote headlines. He was implicated by a main witness and other accounts in several killings, one of a barback at a card game, one in Queens tied to a rival circle, and the fatal attack on a made man whose death defined his own. He was rumored to have participated in the punishment of the musician whose failure to destroy a van endangered the crew. He faced arrest typical of that life, none of which turned into long stints that could have interrupted his trajectory. Then he disappeared, and the file with his name shifted from active to unsolved. If you want to understand why he rose, look at how he navigated the line between pressure and patience. He knew that most people will choose the easiest path if you frame it as their own idea. He learned to suggest rather than demand, to make a man fill in the blank with the answer you wanted. That technique works in a coffee shop as well as a warehouse. It keeps blood pressure low and wallets open. When he dropped the mask and leaned on fear, it was usually because he believed speed demanded it, or because temper did what temper does. The people around him planned their moves around both versions of him. If you want to understand why he fell, return to that single night with the Gambino whose status made him untouchable without permission. That is the pivot point. A dozen other moves might have been forgiven, or at least managed through negotiation. That move brought a wider world into the room. A world where even your own bosses may not be able to shield you without starting a war they don't want. He lived for another stretch after that, long enough to earn, to plan, to stand near the biggest score of his time. But a clock started when Benvenna died, and it ticked across every cigarette lit at the lounge and every engine idling on Rockaway Boulevard. Decades later, a courtroom revisited the Lufthansa story with new faces and old names. Prosecutors argued from archives, from memory, from threads that had sat in boxes for years. A verdict landed that surprised some and satisfied others. None of it altered what had happened to him. The renewed attention only underlined how long his story has lived in the city's bloodstream. Reporters wrote recaps. Former agents gave interviews. People who had once bought watches out of trunks remembered quick deals and quicker goodbyes. The man at the center of this account stayed where he had been since 1979. Gone, unresolved, discussed in voices that shift between certainty and hedged phrases. The families connected to him moved on because life forces that move. Children grow. Schools change. Bills arrive. Holidays complicate themselves. In that stream, the lack of an official ending gnaws, and then it dims. Photographs fade. A jacket goes out of style. A street gets repaved. The airport that helped define his days starts to look cleaner and more sealed off, even if those who remember can still picture the exact door where a guard turned his head to cough at 5:12 a.m. Memory acts like that. It picks details and discards context, and over time context becomes opinion. He remains important because his life lines up the pieces that make that period legible. A young man learns a system that rewards nerve and discretion. He excels by treating crime like a trade, emphasizing timing over theatrics. He commits acts that bring in money and acts that draw lines across which enemies do not negotiate. He helps set the stage for an audacious theft that captures a nation's attention. He vanishes in a way that fits the code he chose to live under. Investigators, writers, and filmmakers turn the story over until the edge is smooth and the center holds. That center is a person defined as much by discipline as by temper. A person who believed he could move through dangers he helped create. Walk out near the cargo buildings at dawn, and you can sense the echo. Workers in reflective vests tug pallets under brighter lights now. Cameras blink from higher angles. The air smells the same diesel, coffee, damp cardboard. The city keeps its promises to itself. To keep moving, to forget a little, to remember in flashes. Somewhere between those impulses sits his legacy, not as a legend to admire or a cautionary tale to scold, but as a set of facts that explain why that neighborhood felt the way it did when he was present, and why it went quiet in a particular way after he was gone. Spring settled across Queens with that washed-out sky that makes everything look newly painted, and the airport went on ticking like a metronome. Out on the service roads, drivers still tapped ash out of cracked windows and traded gossip that slid between ball scores and court dates. In that everyday blur, his story kept working its way through conversations quietly, like a draft moving under a door. People weighed what they'd seen with what they'd heard, and the gap between the man they knew and the movie version of him turned into its own kind of legend. To understand him, you had to start with the place he held in that structure. Not a boss, not a figurehead, but a crucial link between plans drawn in back rooms and money arriving on time without a fuss. The world he lived in ran on distinctions outsiders often miss. At the top were men with formal standing. Beneath them sat crews of earners and enforcers, some eligible for rank, some never eligible no matter how much they delivered. The strategist he answered to couldn't be formally inducted because of his ancestry, yet he commanded respect through brains and results. Thomas, by contrast, had the heritage that made him eligible for a ceremony if politics aligned. That difference mattered. It fueled hope and competition. It explained why he carried himself with the care of someone who believed official status might one day match the authority he already exercised in practice. It also deepened the sense of caution around him among rivals who saw his rise as both likely and risky. Week to week, his work stitched together a patchwork of income streams. Bookmakers needed protection from slow-pay bettors and aggressive competitors. Small loan offices required firm hands to keep interest coming in. Unlicensed card rooms depended on someone who could calm a table when an argument threatened to flip a game into chaos. He visited all of those places with a manner that signaled this won't take long. He had a knack for getting a nod before he finished a sentence. That talent made him efficient and, inside that economy, valuable. It kept blood pressure low even when the topic was money owed, stock diverted, or an employee who had begun talking too freely about things no one wanted repeated. At the airport, his favorite terrain, he moved like someone who knew the weight of a set of keys without needing to hold them. He understood the sequence that carried a shipment from a plane to a secure room to a truck, and he learned where that sequence could be bent for profit without leaving fingerprints. Anyone looking for drama would have been bored by his best work. He liked checks and double checks. He favored changes that looked like normal mistakes. A misplaced pallet number. A van staged in a spot just outside the view of a camera that hadn't been fixed since winter. A shift swap that put a friend on a particular door for an hour. Little choices added up to big payouts. That sense of scale of turning inches into miles was where he shined. The other part of his record speaks for itself because it's repeated in overlapping sources. A young runner, known by a nickname, dying after a card game argument. A Queen's figure tied to a rival circle, killed after a personal feud that became neighborhood business. An inducted member of another family assaulted and killed, a line everyone knew not to cross without permission. Those events redefined how people said his name. Before them, he was the tall guy who got things done. After them, he was a man around whom rooms got careful. He kept operating because the machine he fed kept moving, and because he believed results bought time. But from that point on, every move he made took place under a shadow he could not get out from under. He had small run-ins with the law in those years, the routine frictions of the trade arrests that read like a shorthand for his job. Possession of stolen property, assault, disorderly conduct tied to a brawl that ended quickly once he showed his face. Most didn't stick. Witnesses ducked subpoenas. A docket got postponed until a season later, when memories weren't as crisp. He learned that, with a competent lawyer and disciplined habits, the system could be navigated. That knowledge hardened into confidence. It made him double down on the practices that had kept him in motion since his teens. Meet in person. Avoid careless talk. Stick to trusted circles. Prefer leverage to noise. The Lufthansa windfall and its aftermath brought both validation and danger to a peak. Secrecy made the job possible, and then poisoned the air after it. Slices were withheld or trimmed, timelines stretched, worry spread. Men who had played small roles asked loudly for larger envelopes. Men who had played large roles were told to wait. The killing of the musician who failed to dispose of the van sent a message that no one missed. Whether or not he pulled the trigger, his presence in enforcement decisions after that mistake is part of multiple accounts. The clean lines he admired in earlier jobs grew jagged as everyone tried to limit their exposure. Less talk, fewer faces, tighter lists. Those constraints work on paper until pride and fear collide. By then, his standing in his own circle was complicated. Senior figures valued his reliability and his nerve. Some also resented the volatility that could turn a tidy meeting into a crisis. Later testimony suggested that personal grievances, private slights, crossed wires in relationships that were supposed to stay neatly separated, spiced the calculus that governed how much protection he could expect. Those claims sit in the gray space between memoir and record. What doesn't sit in gray is the rule everyone agrees on. The death of a made man in another family sits on a separate shelf. Protecting a valued earner has limits when that shelf gets opened. The men who wrote those rules were still alive in 1979, and the response they authorized was as predictable as it was final. Some of the clearest windows into his world came from men who later chose cooperation over silence. The most famous among them offered a portrait of Thomas as a study in contrasts, methodical for long stretches, then combustible, thoughtful about logistics, then dismissive of danger when he felt disrespected. That portrait was shaped by deals, fear, and memory. Even so, it matched the outlines investigators had already traced. Names in phone books, plates caught by cameras, overlaps in attendance at wakes and weddings that, in that world, mattered as much for intelligence as for grief. It matched the tone of the city's coverage, too. Articles that moved from euphemisms like underworld figure to phrases like missing and presumed dead, without ever printing the detail everyone whispered, who pulled the string and why. Time kept clarifying his impact, even as his trail went cold. The airport tightened procedures because men like him showed where the weak spots were. Airlines redesigned how cash moved through terminals. Freight handlers learned that routine is a liability when people with discipline study it for patterns. The Port Authority's investigators borrowed techniques from other agencies and built teams to look beyond one-off thefts. The response took years, but it put dents in the kind of business he and his friends had run like clockwork. The fact that institutions adapted is part of his legacy, a strange one he would not have wanted credit for but earned anyway. Closer to home, a different kind of reckoning took place. People who had leaned on his presence found themselves having to explain their demands without the benefit of his reputation filling in the gaps. Others who had chafed under his manner, men who didn't like how small he could make them feel, even while smiling, walked into rooms with a lighter step. The neighborhood adjusted the way neighborhoods do, slowly, then all at once. A new enforcer learned the routes. A different collector set terms at the card table. The bar he had haunted turned into a place where someone else told the stories, and someone else avoided cameras. The city is merciless that way. It fills vacancies without ceremony. Years later, federal interest in the old heist sparked again. A trial placed familiar names back in headlines. Prosecutors dug out boxes, dug holes in backyards, dug through transcripts, and asked juries to trust maps built from memory and paper that had browned at the edges. The verdicts reminded everyone that courtrooms measure truth differently than living rooms. Acquittals and convictions arrived unevenly. None of it altered his fate. He remained the blank line in a report that lists last known whereabouts and then stops. The renewed attention did, however, highlight just how enduring those months at the end of 1978 and the start of 1979 had become. A single theft, and its ripples defined a decade of cases. His disappearance sat near the center of that pattern, a hub others were measured against. For his family, the decades turned the missing into a daily absence that blended with normal life. There were birthdays and graduations and headaches unrelated to crime. There were also anniversaries that arrived heavy, as mute reminders. In that respect, the cost of the life he chose shows up outside ledgers. It shows up in the way a person can be erased so completely that the people closest to him have nothing solid to touch when they try to remember. That gap is part of the truth of his story, one that doesn't require embellishment or moralizing. He knew the code he lived under. He accepted what it promised and what it demanded. The end he met is consistent with both. His criminal resume, drawn from the most reliable overlapping sources, is not a tangle if you line it up. He learned the airport racket as a teenager, graduated to orchestrating hijackings and cargo diversions, and served as an enforcer for gambling operations and high-interest loans that sat under his crew's umbrella. He participated in the 1967 theft from an airline cargo vault that proved access beats theatrics. He was inside the planning coil and enforcement ring around the 1978 airport vault job that rewrote the record books for cash robberies. He was implicated in multiple killings by an associate whose later cooperation aligns with other accounts. The death of a barroom runner, a Queens homicide tied to rival associates, and the fatal assault of a formerly inducted member of another family. He has also been linked to the retaliation that followed a failed post-robbery task. Arrests came and went without long sentences. Then he vanished, and every official record since has treated that absence as permanent. He was in his late 20s when all of this ended. That youth matters. It explains some of the impatience that people remember. It underscores how compressed his education was, decades of lessons crammed into a handful of years, because the pace of that world demanded acceleration. He learned to look past uniforms to the people wearing them, past locks to the hands that held keys, past a shout to the silence that usually followed when he stepped into a doorway. He also learned to interpret respect as currency and slights as threats to his account. He reacted accordingly. The balance he kept for a time between calculation and impulse held until the largest possible bill arrived. If you strip away myth and look at the choices, a pattern emerges. He pursued stability through work that created instability by definition. He sought official recognition inside a framework that denied it to most and punished mistakes without appeal. He trusted a tight circle that in turn trusted him, yet that circle existed beneath forces that answered to older alliances and older laws. When people talk about him now, the specifics sometimes blur, but the core is consistent. He could organize a job with care, keep a dozen actors on script, and then undo months of safety with one moment of pride or anger. Both parts are true at once. Walk a block down from the old lounge today, and you'll see the city that outlasted him. Kids in team jackets walk home from practice. Delivery vans double park in the same spots they always did. A man in a suit steps into a coffee place where a jukebox once played. You can stand there and almost hear the scratch of a match and the clink of a glass, the low boom of laughter that meant a problem had been solved. He lived in that soundtrack, contributed to it, and then left a silence behind that people learned to fill. His story doesn't ask for sympathy or condemnation. It asks to be understood on its own terms. A life built on timing, nerve, and the belief that you can keep moving faster than consequences. For a while he did. Then he couldn't. The lasting lesson from his arc is both simple and hard to accept for people who want tidy morals. Skill can buy time. Loyalty can buy protection. Money can buy almost anything for a while. But there are rules in that underworld that sit above skill, loyalty, and money. He bet against those rules during a night that everyone remembers for what it set in motion, and the house, as it usually does, collected. In that sense, his disappearance closes the loop with a brutal kind of logic. Planes touched down the next morning. Trucks rolled. People went to work. The city absorbed the loss and kept its schedule, which is exactly what it had taught him to do all along. By late summer, the baggage carts still rattled over cracked concrete, and baggage handlers still swapped tall tales over coffee, as if nothing in the world ever changed. In that hum, though, certain names turned into currents beneath the chatter, and his was one of them. People told the story differently depending on where they'd stood, what they'd risked, and how close they'd been when the air in a room shifted. The outline didn't waver much anymore. A boy learned from men who treated favors like currency. A teenager drifted toward an airport that offered quiet access to money. A young enforcer grew into a cornerstone of a crew that made schedules bend. Then a handful of acts, retold by witnesses and tracked by investigators, wrote an ending that matched the strictest rules of the world he served. He had been born in 1950, far from the runways that later defined his days, to a family already familiar with the unwritten codes of the rackets. By the time he was old enough to run errands, he was in Queens, noticing who counted envelopes at the end of the night and who made problems disappear with a phone call that didn't last a minute. The lessons came in pieces. How to listen more than you spoke. How to show up early and leave before questions started. How to treat access like a tool. The city taught the rest. Corner stores were bulletin boards, bars were offices, and an airport with its tangle of deliveries and departures was a machine with more seams than any single company could guard. The place to be was near the runways. Idlewild had become JFK, but the old habit of calling it by the old name stuck with men who'd been hustling there for years. Inside that web, he found a mentor whose nickname softened the fact that he ran things with a spreadsheet in his head and a memory that scared people. Working under that strategist meant doing practical work that never made headlines. Rounding up a driver who drifted, straightening splits that had tilted too far toward greed, persuading a warehouse man to forget a serial number. The crew around the strategist included a connector who knew every bookmaker within shouting distance and more than a few beyond that radius. Together they built a business that looked, from the outside, like chance. From the inside, it looked like choreography. One early score became a marker because of its elegance. In 1967, the Air France theft showed exactly how much could be done with patience and inside help. No costumes, no elaborate disguises, no spectacle, just timing, a key, and a quiet walk past locks that had been treated too casually for too long. He liked that kind of job. It matched his temperament when he felt most like himself, organized, alert, and committed to leaving no footprint bigger than a shoe print on a warehouse floor. The problem for men who prefer clean lines is that life throws angles. The 70s brought pushes and slights, and he responded to more than one in ways that had nothing to do with elegance. Testimony gathered later, and accounts corroborated in law enforcement files, put his name next to several deaths. A cardroom runner with a nickname died after an argument turned ugly in a basement where the walls heard too much. Another killing in Queens involved a man connected to a rival circle. A private dispute became neighborhood business with a point of no return. The most consequential act came when a formerly inducted member of the Gambino family was assaulted and killed. That was not a misunderstanding to be ironed out. In that world, the line he crossed was clear to anyone who breathed its air. It carried a penalty that didn't require explanation. He kept the trucks moving and the money flowing anyway, betting that usefulness would buy time. For a while it did. His week-to-week role stayed consistent even as the stakes rose. He acted as guarantor for bookmakers who needed more than spreadsheets to keep their ledgers steady. He collected for loans that demanded high payments and offered protection as part of the package. He watched over card rooms where big personalities needed small reminders to keep tempers from reducing profit. He studied the airport's rhythms and found the places where slight detours paid. He wasn't a ranter. The jaw set, the calm voice, the way he stood with his back to a wall, those were the cues that made people decide staying in line was cheaper than testing the limits. Arrests surfaced now and then. The kind of short-form rap sheet that matched his trade. Possession of stolen goods. A brawl that ended fast once names were spoken. A charge that didn't stick because memories dissolved or witnesses took long trips. The week subpoenas went out. None of those cases carved out long pauses in his life. He kept a lawyer on speed dial, made court dates feel routine, and went back to the route he ran between bars, diners, and loaders' side doors. The pattern wasn't luck. It was a product of a system that often lacked the paperwork to lock a man down when his business model rested on memory and presence instead of signatures. Then came the Lufthansa lead, the largest current in a tide that had been building for years. A worker drowning in bets whispered to a bookmaker who reported to a familiar table. That message moved uphill. Meetings with low voices and high stakes followed. Who knew which door? Who could steer a vehicle inside a fence without a ripple? Who would stand outside to make sure everything folded back to normal before dawn? The plan demanded compartmentalization. Each person carried a piece, and only a few had the shape of the whole. He was in that core, not as the name on the blueprint, but as the man who turned planning into motion and motion into silence. December 1978 wrote the headline, "Cash and Gems Left a Vault." The airport woke up to chaos. The city learned a new number for what a robbery could be. Success invited something sharper than celebration. Payouts were tricky by design. Some men waited and never got what they expected. Others got nervous. Fear is loud, even when nobody talks. The crew enforced discipline to keep the circle small. A musician assigned to dispose of a getaway van failed to complete that task. Agents found the vehicle and built lines from it back toward the crew. The musician was murdered within days. Sources differ on who pulled the trigger, but they do not disagree about the reason or the lesson. By then, anxiety had replaced satisfaction as the dominant emotion in the rooms where the job had been planned. His disappearance followed within weeks. The date most often cited is mid-January 1979. A close associate later told agents that Thomas believed he was going to be formally inducted into the family he served. That detail fits his ambition. Others say he was called to answer for the killing that had broken a rule older than him. He went, and he didn't return. No official scene. No remains. just an absence that hardened into understanding. Many accounts point to Gambino hands delivering a response for the death of their man. Some name a crew that would later become famous for other reasons. None of those claims were sealed by a conviction about his case. The logic doesn't waver, though. In that world, certain choices draw inevitable replies. The consequences rippled outward. The strategist at the heart of his circle, the planner who valued profit over noise, was convicted later on rackets that included a college basketball point-shaving scheme and a separate murder case. He died behind bars in the mid-1990 seconds. The capo, whose protection had sheltered the airport crew, went down on racketeering and served years before dying in the late 1980 seconds. The connector, who would become the most famous storyteller in this saga, chose cooperation in 1980, delivered testimony that built cases against former friends, wrote his way into witness protection, and lived long enough to see his own legend grow. None of those arcs produced a clean line to where Thomas ended up. His file stayed in the missing category, a label that tells the truth without explaining it. The public learned the long version through a book that turned wiretaps and debriefs into a narrative, then through a film that distilled personalities and scenes for a screen where everything has to move faster. The movie got many things right and other things loud. It turned him into a compact blaze of energy. The real man was taller, quieter, more inclined to spend a morning watching a pattern unfold than to boil over for an audience. Both versions share the fuse. The fuse is the part that turned a capable organizer into someone who, in several key moments, put pride above survival and wrote his own deadline. That is not a moral. It is a description that matches what witnesses, agents, and time have sustained. Even after decades, new headlines flickered. In 2013, a search in Queens uncovered remains tied to an old murder connected to the strategist's history, reviving interest in the broader network. In 2014, federal prosecutors charged an elder from a different family in a case that reached back to the Lufthansa theft. A jury returned an acquittal the next year. Those later developments reminded people that long cases don't always settle, and that a city's memory is long when enough money is involved. None of it brought him back. None of it changed the sentence that says, disappeared, presumed dead, and leaves the rest to inference. Set against that backdrop, his record is plain and doesn't need decoration. He earned within a Lucchese crew that treated the airport as a checkerboard with pieces they could move. He helped redirect cargo and hijack trucks, working out splits and selling goods through fences who understood the value of silence. He collected for bookmakers and loan operations, preferring quiet pressure to public displays. He joined in or enforced around thefts that became part of city lore. The 1,967 grab from an airline's vault, and the planning and aftermath of the 1,978 theft that still gets called by the airline's name. According to multiple consistent accounts, he killed men whose deaths shaped his reputation and defined his fate. A barroom runner known by a nickname, a Queens figure close to rival associates, and a formerly inducted member of another family. In some tellings, he also participated in a post-robbery retaliation meant to correct a dangerous mistake. He faced arrests that never grew into long sentences and disappeared at 28 with a family left to fill in blanks no one could fill. If you're searching for why he mattered to the men around him, it's here. He made complicated tasks feel simple. He could take a schedule that looked like a wall and see the door in it. He could walk into a tense room and dial the tone down without a lecture. He had the patience to wait for the right moment and the nerve to act when it arrived. Those skills make money in any industry. In his, they made enemies take notes. They also made leaders trust him with assignments that didn't come with second chances. That trust is the currency he spent until a different ledger, kept by different hands, closed his account. The question of whether he would have been formally inducted if not for the forbidden act hovers over the story because it speaks to what he wanted. Some who knew him insist the ceremony would have come. Others say politics and grudges would have kept him at arm's length. The truth is that inductions are controlled by people who weigh risk alongside loyalty, and his risks had outgrown his value wherever lines between families intersected. The romantic idea of an enforcer finally receiving the ring of unquestioned status runs into the practical logic of an ecosystem that protects its structure more than any individual inside it. The effect he had on the airport's evolution is easier to measure. Procedures tightened because people like him found holes. Cash moved differently. because crews proved it could be lifted cleanly. Timetables adapted because routine turned out to be the softest target. Agencies learned to build cases around patterns, not just seizures. Those institutional changes outlasted every person involved. They are the historical footprint of a man who moved through that world with a craftsman's pride and a gambler's tolerance for risk. For those who lived beside him, the family who waited without answers, the neighbors who knew him by sight, the co-workers who counted on his presence, the legacy came in smaller pieces. A habit of looking over your shoulder on a particular block. A reflex to lower your voice when a certain surname comes up. A photo tucked in a drawer that nobody leaves on the shelf, because explaining it means telling a story that wears people out. That's the human cost of a life run in shadows. It leaves reminders that aren't cinematic and don't resolve on schedule. He remains a figure you can sum up in plain terms without losing the complexity. A young Queens operator who treated crime as logistics. A loyal earner under a planner who preferred precision. A volatile presence when the wrong switch flipped. A participant in high-dollar thefts that reshaped security policy. A man named in multiple killings that shifted his standing from feared to doomed. A father and husband who never came home from a meeting he thought would secure his future. A missing person whose likely end obeyed a code that functions outside official courts. Walk the service road by the cargo buildings at dawn, and it's easy to imagine the old choreography. The coffee steaming in winter air, the forklift beep cutting through the hum, the quiet nod that meant a plan was in motion. He thrived in that setting because it rewarded focus and punished panic. His downfall came from a different arena. The one where tradition is the lever and personal skill doesn't matter once it pulls. The city absorbed the outcome and kept moving because that's what cities do. The story stayed because it connects dots that explain why those years felt the way they did. There is no final scene to offer, no recovered watch, no confirmed burial ground. The closest thing to an ending is the way people who knew him stopped mid-sentence and looked toward a doorway as if he might be about to walk through. He never does. His life sits where the record leaves it. A set of dates, a list of acts, a circle of names, and a gap that even the best storytellers can only outline. The facts are enough. They show how a person can climb fast on nerve and discipline, how a few irreversible choices can call in a bill nobody can dismiss, and how a place like Queens, with its airports and avenues and back rooms, can shape a man and then erase him with the same steady, unblinking pace. And that brings us to the end of tonight's story from the Silent Empires. Thomas DeSimone here, thanking you for joining me on this journey through loyalty, ambition, and the shadows of New York's underworld. If this story helped you relax or drift into the night, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and join our family for more stories of gangsters and forgotten empires. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories reach. Until next time, may the silence of the empire rest over you, and may the echoes of history carry you gently into sleep. Good night.